Hello and welcome to more reflections on playing Tiny Dungeon with my kids, plural. Because the last reflection that we had, I had just played a single session with my son Jonathan, and much to the amazement of anyone, we've played two more sessions with my son Eric as the game master and me shifting over to the role of player. Wow, that's probably a bit of a surprise to anybody watching this, in that the two boys have made their way perfectly through these two sessions of play with none of any characteristic argument either for them as people or for certain stereotypes of fantasy role playing. So this is a minor miracle, and I'm going to take no credit for it whatsoever, except to the degree that, I'm staying calm at the table. But really, it's remarkably solid. Eric has taken quite enthusiastically. He says, "I want to be a DM," and I said, "Okay." And some things that I've tried to emphasize that I think have stuck or were picked up and utilized as given include these. First, that Eric seems to have picked up that when you introduce things, you see what happens with them, and you don't get overcommitted to the next scene. He did have something of a structure of, well, there's somebody up to something, that something has reasons, the activities for the something are causing problems, and therefore we either, smack down on him and thus do a bit of injustice to his intentions, or we figure out, how to solve it or whatever. You can see a little bit of Undertale in this, the idea that you have apparent antagonists who actually you can connect with if you try. A little bit of a next generation thing. Well, you poor people are all suffering here over your little misunderstandings. Why don't we all have a big talk and a group hug and, it'll work out. So it wasn't that easy, actually. But that's a favored model of how to do things. And you also have this interesting notion, though, of, well, okay, do I walk you through the sort of tropes of those structures, and we all know what to do, so you kind of take the cue and go on to the next step of that? Or do we play through situations in a somewhat more in the moment on the ground, and situations can turn out in unexpected ways? So I think Eric kind of picked up the latter. In fact, afterward, he was saying, that really didn't go as I expected, but I'm really happy with it. And that's a good sign to me. And then we turn to Jonathan. I should clarify that Jonathan began, as you may recall, by playing two characters, a dungeoneering dwarf and a trap master, grenade launching salamander dude. And I jumped in with a single character, and I made up, a fantasy race, pixie. So what did I do? I ended up getting a couple of the listed abilities, and I think I made one up called Tiny. And so had a player character that I think is reasonably sane for this. Spell touched, so all kinds of coincidental magic go on around them, intended or not, although, you roll as an ability either way. And perfectly sound little character. And so we worked our way through. First of all, I provided Eric with a map, which I didn't. I used a little temple map before, and now I appropriated a map from Low Fantasy Role Playing by, I believe, one of the contributors who did the map is S.J. Grodzicki. So anyway, this is the map of Melek. And so I went ahead and, as I say, can't use any better word than appropriated, so thank you. We enjoyed your map. And gave it to Eric, and I had him sit down. There are 11 listed spots. And I had him sit down, and I said, pick two of these spots and come up with something interesting and about them. What is in those spots? What do they look like? Or, what kind of things might be happening there? And we'll take it from there. So he did that, actually, and came up with all sorts of interesting things. We were at a library where a fellow swiped some magic books, and we were at the public baths where a tentacular monster was, disrupting everybody's bath. And all sorts of things happened from there. The monster split in two at one point, and one half of which was not vanquished, became a cute little sidekick of ours for a while. And the alchemist who was causing all these problems by unleashing all these monsters all over the place was actually trying to, save the life of a preserved daughter. And we were able to help with that. We were able to work our way through some difficult spots, but not without a whole lot of fighting and a whole lot of kind of disaster coping. Had to deal with the king and queen, had to deal with, upset people, had to do lots of social stuff as well as a lot of, hassles. Now, I want to emphasize that Eric was really good about looking at the way a roll turned out and saying, okay, well, then that problem or that situation is really going to proceed from now on. And then he used those as kind of environment or context for stuff that he did have already established. And so he did a really nice job of that. I said I was going to talk about Jonathan, though. Now, this is interesting because Jonathan was kind of experimenting and feeling his way through what you can do with dice and fiction. So a few times he would talk about how, all right, here comes the roll. Now let's set up all the things that this roll is going to manage or account for. And so he would talk a little bit about what's going on, or he would say, well, how about if this is happening, and stuff like that. And then he also, in a couple of cases, would say, okay, well, now that the roll has turned out this way, well, what else? What gets dragged in by this roll? Or what, and this is the important part, what was going on before, after all, now that we know how the roll turned out? And this was kind of interesting because there are limits to this kind of thing. If you're playing in such a way that you're kind of rolling pro forma and you can, alter the fiction before and after the roll as you see fit every time, then really the dice aren't doing much except giving, your hands something to do, or somehow formalizing turn order at most. Whereas if you have sort of rules which differ from game to game about what goes into a roll, what is the minimal necessary fictional stuff, and the limits of what you can know going into a roll. And then after, what is the minimal necessary impact on the fiction of the dice, which has to be accorded with. And then also, what are you and aren't you permitted to alter about what's going on at the moment, that is to say, outcomes and contexts of that success or failure, and then also to some extent a little bit of back tweaking about how it came out to be that way. So Jonathan kind of tested the limits of those, and I tried to articulate as we went along what the limits are for Tiny Dungeon, which is a little different from any number of other games. Every game has its own little interesting profile for these things. And so it also is real clear about what a game master's job is in terms of managing the adjustable fictions. Tiny Dungeon, in my opinion, may struggle a bit with that language, but on the other hand, it's pretty clear that it has a distinct vision for it. So it's very useful because I could actually turn to those paragraphs and say, okay, you see, this book actually talks about what Eric can do about these things. It's not as clear about what a player might or might not do, but since it kind of gives it to Eric, our discussion of it has to turn it over to him. And so it was a real nice kind of practical investigation of the available authorities. And as I say, Jonathan was kind of finding out where those limits were. And when he found out where it was, he was like, oh, okay, well, that's how we do it then. So it turned out really to be almost this seminar in many ways, as far as an observer might be concerned, about authorities in role playing, and in a very good way. I mean, you could actually see people say, oh, so this is how we talk, this is how we say, this is how we cope with roles, this is how we find out what happened and also make what happened at a number of different levels. And I liked it quite a lot. I'm a little astonished still, and Eric says he has, other adventure ideas, and that's great. So there's some talk about continuing, and I have to give massive credit to Tiny Dungeon for this remarkable experience that I had pretty much given up on ever happening. So, fantastic.